We rise, humbly hearted rise, won't be divided rise, with spirit to guide us rise, in hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise. All of the children rise. Elders with wisdom rise. Ancestors surround us rise. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise up from the wreckage, rise with tears and with courage, rise fighting for life. We rise in hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise, humbly hearted rise, won't be divided rise, with spirit to guide us rise.
Good evening, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you. Shavua Tov to everyone on the call. My name is Morty Labaton, and I'm Hadar's Director of Programs. Thank you so much for joining us for Hadar's Yom Kippur Derasha. That song we were just listening to was We Rise by Batya Levine from the recently released album Karov. As I'm speaking, as you've started already, please feel free to chat where you're tuning in from so we can get a sense of who's here with us tonight. Tell us a little bit about how your Shabbat went, and tell us what you're looking forward to this week. We're so glad to see everyone, whether this is your first time learning with your Hadar, or your 100th, or your second or third. As our communities face the challenge of connecting to each other in the usual ways, we're especially glad to be able to convene this group on the eve of Shabbat Shuvah for a bit of singing and a piece of Torah. We hope that the community we have here and the learning we're going to do together can bring you some grounding and meaning. To keep our attention and focus, we're going to turn off chat during most of the sermon, but we'll turn it back on at the end of the program to give us a chance to say Shana Tova once again to each other and wish us all a good week. You'll be able to chat with me throughout the program if anything comes up. We are happy to offer closed captioning for this program. To access live subtitles, you can click the CC button at the bottom of the window and select Show Subtitle. For some folks, you might have to click More and then say Show Subtitle at the bottom. If you've turned them on by accident, or if they are on right now and you're finding them distracting, or for any other reason would like to close them, You can also close them by clicking More and clicking Hide Subtitles at the bottom. Once again, we're just so glad to have you here with us. And I'm going to turn it over to our darshan for the evening, Rabbi Avi Strausberg.
Hi, everyone. Shavua Tov. I'm Avi Strausberg, calling into you from DC. It's such a pleasure to get to be with you tonight, and such a pleasure to start my week with you as we get ready to go into Yom Kippur. I spent a year in my 20s living in a town called Nelson on the South Island of New Zealand. After several months of being in New Zealand, I began noticing that I hadn't met anyone else who was Jewish. At first, I couldn't believe it. And then I started asking around, do you know anyone who is Jewish? I love my scenic surroundings so much that I was considering applying for New Zealand citizenship, but I was also beginning to long for the Jewish community that had been given in my East Coast upbringing. Months passed. I grew more comfortable in my work at a small family-owned organic grocery store. I even made a few friends, and still, I found no Jews. And then finally, one morning, I was standing behind the register at the green grocer, and someone came into the store and said, "Are you Avi?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "We heard you've been looking for us." I had found my first Jew in New Zealand, or rather, she had found me. Rabbi Kolonimus Kalman Shapira, or the Eish Kodesh, writes that there are two types of being lost. The context for his drasha on Parshat Toldot is that Rabbi Shapira is writing during the time of the Holocaust, between the years of 1939 and 1941. He's writing from the Warsaw Ghetto during a period in which he bore witness to the mass dehumanization and the killings of not only his community, but multiple members of his family. He's writing from a place of experiencing the most extreme physical and emotional suffering firsthand. Tonight, I want to look inside his Torah on what it means to be lost and what it means to be found, to see how it might deepen our understanding of tshuva, or the return to oneself that is central to Yom Kippur. For those of you who want to follow along with the text, we'll share a link to it in the chat now, but also feel free to just stay here and listen, and you'll have the sources available to you afterwards. So we're in his drasha on Toldot. He begins with a verse from Isaiah. Uvau ha'ovdim be'eretz Ashur, ve'anidachim be'eretz Mitzrayim. They will come, those who are lost in the land of Assyria and those who are outcast in the land of Egypt. And he says, Sheyishnam bechinat ovdim ubechinat nidachim. That there are two types of being lost. There are those who are lost, and there are those who have been pushed out. Nidach, husharak nidach mimkomo lemakom rachok. To be nidach, this one type of being lost, it's just that you have been sort of pushed out from one place to another place that is further from your place. Aval nikar benirehu. But still, in this case, you are known and you are recognizable. Mashe enoken ovedhu shene'evad lo nir'eh velo nirkar. But this is different than the experience of being an oved, of being one who is truly lost, in which this person has been lost and they become unrecognizable and no one no longer knows them. So we have these two experiences of nidach and to be an oved. One is to simply be, you are pushed out from where you are relocated, you are far from where you once were, but you are still essentially you are still essentially recognized. And another is to be oved, to be so far lost that you are not even recognizable anymore. He goes on to say, Shatzarot mitrabot ata kol kach, v'gam pashut misaprim skanei Yisrael. When the troubles are so greatly increased as with now, and they simply cut off the beards of Jews. She'al zeh chitzunitam einam nikarim, umerov redifot ve'yisurim kashim mintzo she'i efshar l'she'er. That they become unrecognizable on their outsides, and from all the persecutions and from all the great difficulties that are so impossible to bear that it's impossible to even sort of give count to them. Gam b'penimiotam enam nikarim, ad shegam ha'ish be'atzmo oved, ve'et atzmo eino makir, until such that on the outsides they're unrecognizable, but also on the insides, it gets to such a place that also on the insides, a person can't be recognized, so much so that the person themselves loses themselves and doesn't recognize themselves anymore. A person doesn't know, how did they feel last Shabbat? Or how did they feel during the week before the davening or at the time of the davening, or things like this, that you can't even remember your own experience anymore because you're so lost in yourself. Ve'ata nidras v'nirmas ad she'eino margish im ish Yisraelhu, im adamhu, or behema, she'en la shum metziut le'argish. Until a person is so crushed and trampled that they don't know anymore whether a Jew, whether they're a human being, if they're a person, or if they're an animal that has no experience of sort of feeling anymore. That when a person is so crushed and so trampled and so dehumanized, as people were in the Holocaust, the outsides are changed, but actually the insides are changed as well, to the extent that a person is unrecognizable to them own selves, that they don't even recognize themselves if they're a Jew, if they're a person, if they're an animal that is able to feel in this way. And this is what it means to be obed. This is what it means to be lost in the pasuk, in the verse in Isaiah, that the lost will come. He then goes on to say, Aval Gemara omeret, but the Gemara teaches in Masechet Kiddushin, Baal Aveda mechazer achar avedato, that the one who has lost something goes after, pursues the thing that they have lost. Kishen evda ha'aveda lo nir'eh v'lo nirkeret. That when something is lost, it's not seen anymore and it's not recognized anymore. Mechazer bala aveda chareha, but the bala aveda, the one who has lost that thing, goes after the thing that I've lost. Nimtza lehagbiha lehavia alav, to find it and to raise it up, to reacquire it, and to bring it back to oneself. V'halo hakadosh baruch hu bala aveda shelanu, and isn't the Holy One the finder of us? So now he's saying we normally have this idea of a Baal Avodah. If an object is lost, that it may be unseen to everyone else around it, but the Baal Avodah, the finder, the one who owns that object, they always see that object. They feel the presence of it being lost, and they will go after it, and they will find it until eventually they bring it back to them. And who is the one, when we are lost, who is our finder? Who is the one who is always aware of our presence, even when we don't recognize ourselves? It's God. God is our Baal Avodah. Baal Aveda yachzor aleinu limso otanu v'liten lanu kol tov. And God as our Baal Aveda, God as our finder, the finder of that which is lost, even ourselves, God is going to come after us. God will pursue us, and God will find us, and God will give us all that is good. L'hashivenu elav yitbarach, and to bring us back to Him. That word l'hashivenu, to bring us back to God. Ligo aleinu ge'ula ufedut gufenu, to give us a full redemption and redemption of our bodies, right? These bodies that have been lost to us, these bodies that have been changed on the inside and changed on the outside. Ultimately, God is a Baal Avodah. God will bring us back. God will redeem us in our bodies and in our spirits, v'nafshenu, and also in our spirits, v'rachamim rabim v'shuat tovot, with great compassion and with great deliverance. The times in which the Eish Kodesh is writing are times, thank God, so far from our own. He's describing a condition of being lost, in which one's humanity has been so degraded, in which a person is so broken that she no longer recognizes her own self. With great caution, I want to learn something from his Torah, with the understanding that there is no comparing the experience of Jews in the Holocaust with our experience today. And at the same time, there's deep wisdom and beauty in his Torah. And we'd be remiss if we didn't study his Torah to learn wisdom that we can apply to our own times. So Rabbi Shapiro teaches that there are two types of being lost. Sometimes we are nidachim. We are misplaced. We are removed from our place, but we have lost our way. We've lost ourselves a bit, but we are still recognizable to ourselves. When we look in the mirror, if we look hard, we still know who we are, but we've gotten off course somehow. Perhaps we put other people's needs before ours so often that we forget that we too have needs. Perhaps we found ourselves in a job that is far from anything that we imagined ourselves. Perhaps we feel misplaced in our relationships. We are in a rut. We fight more than we don't. We no longer talk to each other with the love we once had. But if we stop, if we assess, we can see our way back. And then sometimes we are ovdim. We have lost ourselves so entirely that our lives, our relationships, our being is unrecognizable even to ourselves. And it seems like there is no way back. Yom Kippur is meant to be that time of return. The shofar is the sound that brings us back. In the book of Isaiah, we read, V'haya b'yom hahu yitaka b'shofar gadol. And on that day, a great ram's horn shall be sounded. Uva'u ha'ovdim be'eretz Ashur ve'anidachim be'eretz Mitzrayim. V'shachavu la'Hashem b'har hakodesh b'Yerushalayim. And those who are lost, the strayed in the land of Assyria, and those who are pushed out, the expelled who are in the land of Egypt, they shall come and they shall bow to God on the holy mount in Jerusalem. Notice this verse from Isaiah is the same verse we saw in the Eish Kodesh. The lost will come and those expelled who are in Egypt. But here we see it in its full context, in the context of the call of the shofar. We encounter words very similar to the first part of this verse, Uveshofar gadol yitaka, in our liturgy on Yom Kippur during Unetana Toke. Here in Isaiah, we see that it is the sounding of the shofar that brings those who have been exiled back together and ultimately restores them to a life they once knew. It is the same shofar that we sound on Yom Kippur that makes tshuva, the process of return, possible, that signals it's time to do the work to come back to ourselves and to each other. Who sounds the shofar that calls us back together? According to Midrash Tanaim, it is none other than God. In Midrash Tanaim, we learn, Shepizer et Yisrael lo pizran ele b'shofar, that when God scattered Israel, God only scattered them by means of the shofar, as we read in Jeremiah, Ki kol shofar shemanu, that we heard the sound of the shofar at the beginning of the war. And when God brings us back, God will bring us back by means of the shofar. And as we heard in Isaiah, on that day, a great shofar will be sounded, and those who are lost will come back. We learn in Midrash Tanaim that it was the sound of the shofar that signaled our exile in the first place. It was through the blast of the shofar that God sent us out. And it is also through the sounding of the shofar that God brings us back. Powerfully, we imagine here that it is none other than God that sounds the shofar for us on Yom Kippur. It is God that calls to us and says it's safe to come back now. It's time to return. This Midrash calls to mind the teaching of the Eish Kodesh in which God is our Baal Avidah. God is our finder, and we are the Ovdim, we are the lost. Sometimes when we are lost, when we are so far gone that our lives are unrecognizable even to ourselves, we can't imagine that anyone is looking for us. But according to the Eish Kodesh, God is looking for us even when we can't find our way back. God is sounding the shofar, calling us home. But in Jewish tradition, God is not the only one who serves as the finder, the restorer of lost objects and lost souls. We learn in the book of Devarim that we each have that responsibility to one another. In Devarim we read, Lo tira et shor achicha or et seo nidachim v'italamta mehem hashev teshivem le'achicha. You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep, nidachim, right? That word pushed out or lost, and ignore them. Rather, you shall surely return them to your brother. The text goes on and says, and if your brother is not close to you and you do not know who he may be, ve'im lo karov achicha elecha, if your brother is not close to you, what do? Then you shall gather it into your house, and it shall be with you until your brother inquires for it and you return it to him. You have to hold on to it. If you don't know where the person is, you take it in, you take responsibility for it. And thus shall you do for his donkey, and thus shall you do for his cloak, And this shall you do for any lost thing of your brothers. This is what you should do for anything your fellow loses that may be lost by him and that you find. Lo tuchali, tell them, you shall not ignore it. Devarim teaches us that we have an obligation to return lost objects to one another. If we see our brother's sheep or his cloak or any item of his, we have an obligation to go out of our way to return it to him. Well, the laws of Hashivat Avedah, the laws of returning lost objects, are talking about just that. They're talking about objects. We can understand this obligation to go beyond just possessions. The verse says, Lechol Avedat Achicha, to any lost thing of your fellow. Sometimes we don't just lose our sheep or our cloaks. Rather, we lose ourselves. We allow ourselves to slip away, to get off track. We are lost and it's hard to find the way back. The Torah teaches us that when this happens, when a person loses his donkey or himself, we have an obligation to help a person find their way back to themselves. And if our fellow is not near, meaning perhaps they're not ready to be found, perhaps they are too unrecognizable to themselves, we have an obligation to wait, to just be there, to hold on to the memory of who they were and are until they are once again able to return to themselves. The Eish Kodesh teaches us that God is the Baal Avedah. God is the ultimate finder, the one who calls us together when we are lost, who finds us when we are missing. But Devarim teaches that human beings have the ability and the responsibility to do that for one another. We are in a moment right now when many people might be feeling displaced, nidachim. We might look around at our lives, our relationships, our work, and it may be nearly unrecognizable to what they were 6 months ago. No longer am I a person who leaves the house and goes to a job I love, but perhaps I'm a stay-at-home parent, a teacher, a 24-hour caregiver, trying to squeeze in a few hours of work around the edges. No longer am I a person with a rich web of friendships and relationships that I see on Shabbat and on a daily basis, but perhaps I'm a person living alone, connected to people only via a buzzing laptop screen. No longer am I a person feeling strong and in control of my life, but perhaps I feel fragile and anxious. My health and well-being dependent upon strangers and lawmakers. On Yom Kippur, we not only attempt to find ourselves, but we can be each other's finders. We can remind each other who we are, what matters to us, and help draw one another back with the sound of the shofar. Call a friend and check in on them. Ask them how they're doing and what they need. Remind someone to take time away and take care of themselves. Send someone a care package to remind them that you love them and that your relationship transcends distance. How can you be someone else's finder? Gemar Chatima Tova.
We rise, humbly hearted rise, won't be divided, rise, with spirit to guide us, rise, in hope. In prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise. All of the children rise, elders with wisdom rise, ancestors surround us, rise. prayer. We find ourselves here in hope, in prayer. We're right here in hope, in prayer. We find ourselves here in hope, in prayer. We're right here and we rise up from the wreckage, rise with tears and with courage, rise fighting for life. We rise in hope, in prayer. We find ourselves here in hope, in prayer. We're right here in hope, in prayer. We find ourselves here in hope, in prayer. We're right here and we rise, humbly hearted rise, won't be divided rise, with spirit to guide us rise.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Wishing you a meaningful Yom Kippur, and hope you will join us. If you haven't seen already, Hadar is having a full day of programming tomorrow before Erev Yom Kippur to get us into the spiritual, intellectual, and emotional mindset for the day. If you haven't seen any information on that, you should check out hadar.org. It should be the front page, the first thing that you see. Please feel free to join us tomorrow at any time. We'd be so thrilled to have you. And once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to Rabbi Strausberg for those beautiful words of Torah. And we will see you next time. Take care.